I am happy to be here as part of the Embodied Philosophies online conference and this set of teachings, Radical Presence Buddhist Teachings for Modern Day Life. The topic that I'm going to be taking up for my teaching during this time is Radical Dharma, talking race, love, and liberation. So this is a topic that I'm actually spending a lot of time talking about these days, and as it turns out, they're very much relevant for the times that we are in. When we say talking race, love, and liberation, the idea is to really unpack how it is that those three things are related to each other in terms of our greater society and most specifically for our practice of Buddhist teachings. So first of all, I'd like to say a little bit about what it is that the way that I think about radical Dharma, because that's often the question that people ask the first time that they hear the phrase is, what do you mean by radical? And of course, in this society, we have a sense of what the word radical means and a lot of negative connotations from the sense of radical. So radical, if you look at the actual root and etymology of the word, is radix, and what it means is thorough or complete. And so I think of the word radical as relating to complete. And on the other hand, you have then Dharma. And many of us in the Buddhist path think of Dharma specifically around the Buddhist teachings, the historic Buddhist teachings. So we think of that as a capital D, Dharma. So there's the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha teachings. But I'm really holding the sense of Dharma in this sense is not just the historic Buddhist teachings, but also the underlying Dharma that Buddha connected to, which is this idea of law or universal teachings. So universal truth, the law of life, the way in which all things apply, a particular teaching, a particular truth applies to everyone. And so, of course, as many people would say, really what the historic Buddha was a renegade Hindu. He was actually pulling back from the Hindu teachings of the time. And so Dharma existed as a term. And in that term, he held it as a sense of these universal truths. So when you get them together, radical Dharma is about the complete truth, the complete examination of the truth that applies to all of us. Now, when I say all of us, I want to say that in all due respect, I'm talking particularly in this framework about the teachings and how they apply and how we're taking a lens on race in particular in North America. And I say North America specifically, and more specifically the United States, because there's a different set of histories and contexts that exist in both Canada and South America. So if I shortcut and say America, please do know that what I'm referring to is what we now refer to as the United States of America. So the way that I see it as someone that has really come into my own being as a fully developed adult human being has been very much through the teachings of the Buddha. And as I came through my own experience and life path unfolding through the Dharma, through the historic Buddhist teachings, through my relationship with Zen Sangha and community, one of the things that I realized, as many people realize that are interested in justice and truth and liberation across the board, is that there was a significant absence of people of color, and more specifically Black people within the Zen Sanghas especially, but more broadly across the board in Buddhist teachings. And that, of course, exposed as well that largely the Buddhist teachings were reaching predominantly, not only, but predominantly middle to upper middle class whites. Now, any of us that have been touched by the Buddhist teachings knows and realizes almost immediately that these are teachings that apply really to anyone. They can be applied to anyone In fact, one of the things that Buddhist teachings are known for in America, in particular through the mindfulness movement, is its infiltration into other so-called religions, so that people that are Jews practice Dharma and Buddhist teachings. People that are Christians are in fact not just practicing Buddhist teachings, but also they are teachers themselves, bona fide sanctioned teachers within Buddhist lineages, but as Christians, as Native American people, as Jews. So in many ways, the historic Buddhist teachings and many of the ideas and philosophical frameworks that are laid out are universal teachings. They are Dharma, which is part of the reason that the historic Buddhist teachings were referred to as Dharma. It was to say that truly, before we started calling this Buddha's teachings or the Buddhist teachings, these were simply universal teachings that could be applied to anyone in their life at any given time that they chose to do so. And as the Buddha always admonished, the teachings were not so much about, as he offered them, were not so much about faith, but he would say, only when you have practiced it and applied this to your own life should you accept these teachings as the truth, not because I said it, not because it was written, not because you heard it from someplace, but only when you apply these teachings in your life should you accept them as being true. And I want to offer that for the sharings that I'm about to make throughout this talk, is to say that initially some of the things that I may say may be unusual or unexpected, or I want to say actually downright uncomfortable for you. And as the Buddha suggested, the best path to take is to not simply decide whether you think this is true or not true, but to actually take it up, attempt to apply it to your life, to look at it through the lens of your own experience, the experience that now comes with new information that's being shared here today, and see if those teachings, if those offerings are actually applicable. So the idea here is not to say this is simply the truth, even when I say radical Dharma, the complete universal truth. It's not to say that this is the truth, but it is certainly a truth that is worthy of exploration. So in recognizing that the Buddhist teachings seem to be, I want to say, stuck in a particular class when there was nothing about the teachings that suggested that that should be the case, I became quite interested in exploring that, not just for my own interest and not just for the interest of the people that I knew in my life that were people of color that would certainly benefit, and people that were of lower incomes and socioeconomic classes that could benefit from the teachings of the Buddha. But I became interested in what it meant, in fact, that a teaching that's so universal, so applicable, so accessible in many ways could find itself confined within what I understood to be a social order that had actually been made up, a construct that we refer to as race, that had been made up for very specific purposes hundreds of years ago in this country. So what is it about an idea, a concept, a mere construct of socialization that could find its way piercing through and enclosing or trapping a teaching that's so universal inside of that social order, which is what led me to the idea of radical Dharma, which was to say that, in this country in particular, one of the things that keeps our society, one of the fundamental root causes, I would say, the root causes of suffering in our society, happens to be this construct of racial categories or racialization that was at one time decided upon and developed in order to keep classes of people apart, in order to keep people organized around different socioeconomic classes so that we could commodify the resources, the human resources of a particular peoples, Black peoples, and also to confer benefits upon people, white peoples, so that those people would not get together that were of the same class, but of different uses in terms of what the social needs were. So the social needs were to have people to work the land. The social needs were to be able to have people to work the land and to take care of crops and take care of children and take care of property and that kind of thing in such a way that people could be enriched. And of course, we are all at least moderately aware of slavery and the system of slavery in America, but many people do not realize that that system was developed precisely in order to, that race was developed precisely in order to keep the system of slavery in place. Because at one time, white folks were also white-skinned people from different countries, from Ireland, from Germany, were also part of those lower classes, and they entered into this country in indentured servitude, which was a form of slavery. But it was a limited form of slavery, and in that limited form of slavery, you had already had different classes of people and different categorizations of people set up, so that Blacks, the so-called Blacks, as they were named by that categorization, were kept in slavery for the totality of their lives and into next generations and into their offspring. And whites, on the other hand, white-skinned people that came from different classes that were trying to make their way into America, were entitled to actually be able to pay their way out of slavery through their work within 7 years. So that's a kind of basic history lesson, and we need that history lesson in order to understand why would we talk about race in order to relate to love and to liberation. Well, when you have a design, when you have a construct, and the Buddha understood this, when you had a construct that you begin to believe in as who you are, you begin to forget who you actually are. And the Buddha in his time actually looked at that pattern of behavior, that development of the construct of an identity, of a notion of a self, as something that actually inhibit us from being free, from being liberated. And the way that I relate this conversation, and many of us should begin to think about how we relate our relationship to race in this country, is that in the very same way that the personal ego is a construct that the Buddha understood inhibited our ability to be free, inhibited our ability to know who we truly are, to be liberated in how we show up in the world, because we are instead placing our belief of who we are in this construct that got called ego. So many of us understand that, especially in American Buddhism, as psychology got related to Buddhism and entered into the way in which Western Buddhism is understood and communicated to Westerners, we began to understand this idea of an ego as something that inhibits us from truly knowing who we are, from truly inhabiting our own being. So we get an idea of a self, an idea of a fixed and structured self that likes this, that prefers that doesn't like this, that has fears and desires and attachments. And so that the ego has these attachments to the concepts of itself, the constructs of itself, the way that it develops itself into a whole entity that almost begins to, and I would say for most of us, begins to exist almost like we have a double life. We have this idea of who Angel is. We have this idea and this concept of who Anne or Sue or Joe or Jacob or Val may be in the world. And we begin to live inside of that construct. And that construct comes with all sorts of ideas, not just of that we have conferred upon it and transferred to it, but also that have been conferred and transferred to it from our families, from the ways in which our parents, our mothers, our fathers, our grandparents, our original family of upbringing gave us ideas about what we should and shouldn't do, who we should love, who we should trust, what is acceptable to us, what is not acceptable to us, what our social norms are, were communicated by our families. They were communicated by the communities in which we grew up in. They were communicated by the religion that we lived inside of. They were communicated, of course, to us by the larger society and time. And we know that's true because there are many things, even as I'm sure I spoke about slavery, that many of us in this day and age would say, that's not something that's acceptable. It's not something that I would abide by or believe in. But the truth is that had we been born in those times, most of us would have believed in the truth, right? The relative truth of those social constructs as given to us. So many white peoples, white-skinned peoples would have understood themselves. You, friends of mine, people that loved ones that I have that are all of white skin, no matter what their heritage was, no matter what their ethnic and country heritage was, they would believe themselves as entitled to ownership and privileges of owning other human beings that were Black people. And given my birth at the time, I may have well believed that the location that I was only destined for was that as a slave, or that as someone that was simply lower class, and never having the opportunity before me to be completely free. So liberation, my freedom, was bound in my race. And likewise, the entitlements of white-skinned people was bound in the development of race. But if you think about it, that actually has a very interesting correlation to the way that personal ego works. In our personal ego, we have a set of beliefs, many of them limiting, many of them perhaps very good for us. But we have a set of beliefs that does not allow us to fully inhabit who we are, to fully experience our sense of being liberated and free to move around, to engage, to reach for things, to aspire to particular things, to be inspired by things, to actually relate to certain people, to relate to people that are not like us, to relate to people that seem very different to us because of class, because of race, because of sexuality, because of gender. All of these things, because of the personal ego that has been constructed and developed by our surroundings and our upbringing in terms of who we are as a person, defines for us our sense of possibility, our sense of openness, our sense of receptivity. And we, as practitioners on the Buddhist path, come to understand that what the Buddha taught, first and foremost, is that we had to peer at this ego, at this notion of a self, if we want to be free.